Afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our monthly webinar series, presented in part with support from the Ohio Arts Council. Today's webinar will focus on historic churches and sacred spaces. Our presenter, Dr. Shelly Stackhouse, was ordained in the United Church of Christ in 1982. A graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary, she has served churches of varying sizes as senior, solo, interim, and transitional pastor in Michigan, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. She now serves as Senior Director of Programs for Partners for Sacred Spaces. She received a PhD from Drew University in Liturgical Studies and has taught at numerous seminaries, most recently Yale and Lexington. She's the author of one book and numerous book chapters and articles, and she currently lives in Connecticut. Shelly, thank you so much for being with us today and presenting the work of Partners for Sacred Spaces. Most of, if not all of our communities have beautiful historic churches in their downtowns or districts. Sometimes they're vibrant and open and still welcoming parishioners, and sometimes they're closed and in peril. So we look forward to hearing what you have to share with us today. At the end of the presentation, you may enter questions in the chat box, and Devin will read those, and Shelly will answer as best she can. So Shelly, thank you again for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm delighted to be with you, and I don't even listen to my own bio anymore, so I'm not sure if I say that I was actually born in Cleveland, Ohio, and spent part of my growing up in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, outside of Columbus, for those of you who don't know it. So I have a heart for Ohio, and I'm glad to be with you today. So talking about exactly what Matt just said, the issue about historic and older sacred places and what's going on right now in the world. So we're going to start by talking about the state of historic sacred places today. And this is what not only we are seeing, but many researchers who are looking into what's been going on really for the last 50 years are seeing. Congregations are shrinking in size and in resources. We could spend an entire webinar talking about why that is, but it is absolutely the case. That doesn't mean every congregation is shrinking in size and resources, but it does mean the majority are, and that would be especially true of the mainline and many Roman Catholic churches as well. And what that means then is a lot of those sacred places, those purpose-built sacred places, are often underused. So what Matt spoke about was sort of the two ends of a continuum of a vibrant, active church and a closed building, but there are lots of places in between that. We'll talk a little bit about that more later. And in between often is where congregations, especially those that were built before the 1950s, those congregations in the 50s often went through a building boom. And sometimes there are separate buildings or large education wings that had hundreds of children at one time and are now underused. And the other thing that we find is that civic leaders, especially if they are not people involved in organized religion, are often unaware of what congregations are experiencing, or this is even more crucial, of what all of those sacred places have to offer. The pandemic has exacerbated this in so many ways. It is too early for us to know what the total fallout of the pandemic is going to be, but the folk at Hartford Seminary who've been doing major studies on this have found that what's happening is that smaller congregations, which are the majority of congregations in this country, and by that we mean congregations under 200 members, those congregations have gotten smaller. Some of the larger congregations have actually grown, but the vast majority have gotten smaller. Across the board, if we say how many people are in attendance in any congregation each week, on average, it's 65. In smaller congregations, often it's down to 20. Now, that means in person, congregations are finding that there were lots of folks who kind of liked the online option. Church in your jammies, as one of my colleagues calls it. So it's really kind of hard to track what that attendance is going to look like. But if they're not in the building, it's impacting the use of the building. Congregations are now returning back to normal. Many, if not all congregations have gone back to some form of in-person worship, often hybrid worship. During the pandemic, a lot of congregations that hosted outside programs closed them down. And what they're finding is that some of those programs have not come back because they either found other places to go or they changed their formatting to become virtual themselves. Some of them are not coming back. Many of them are. And preliminary indications suggest that many congregations have lost members in the pandemic. And really, I think it just exacerbated what was already a trend. On the other hand, what we know at Partners is that sacred places have enormous value. We did a number of studies, and out of all of those studies, we discovered that the people that use a church, and I think synagogues, this may be a different story with, we can talk about synagogues at another point, but who uses a church during the week, congregation members versus non-members, you can see 81% of the people who are using a church building, a church space over the week, are not members. They're not there for worship. They're there for meetings of organizations. They're there for AA meetings, Boy Scout, Girl Scout troops, feeding programs, food pantries, clothing, closets. They're there to attend a wedding of somebody else or a funeral. So most congregations have lots of people in them during the week that are not members. I'm going to talk about several findings from a study that's now over 20 years old, but our research says is still very, very true. And this is called Sacred Places at Risk. You can find it actually on our website under our publications. It was published in 1998 with help from the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. And this is what we found. 93% of congregations open their doors to the community. They understand their building to have civic value, to be a place where the community should find use, not just for worship on Sunday. And congregations host 76% of their community service programs in their own buildings. So things like offering a soup kitchen or programs for children. The average congregation provides about 5,300 hours of volunteer support each year to its programs. Now, one of the issues with the membership currently falling and with the pandemic is sometimes that volunteer support has dropped. And we're eager to find out as the research continues what the volunteer hours fallout has been from the pandemic. That Partners for Sacred Places has been doing over the years, we have developed the Economic Halo program, and that is again developed with the folk at University of Pennsylvania. What we realize is that congregations know the value of their buildings and their property, but often civic officials and even some preservation organizations don't understand what the whole value of that place is to a community. The only way to do that is to monetize it. So they developed a formula that looks at all of the different ways that the building and the congregation contribute to the economy of a locality. They did the project first in several cities, and what they came up with was that the average economic halo value per congregation is $1.7 million. Again, you can find more info on this. I'm not going to go through it at length with you right now, but you can see some of the categories of that. And one of those places that's really hard, sort of under in that monetized catalytic place, is that a church building provides a sense of stability often to a neighborhood if it's not empty, if there's activity going on there. That's a critical piece in the midst of all of this. We did a similar study a year and a half ago in rural North Carolina to try to determine, is it the same for rural churches as it is for urban churches? The number that was come up with was $735,800 of contribution to a local economy. The civic value of congregations and sacred places is enormous. So, given that what's going on now is nothing less than a tsunami of changes in church buildings and synagogues, by the way, as well, across the country, how can we help faith communities manage this so that the civic value of their building can continue, so that the community doesn't lose everything, both in terms of programs that happen there, in terms of preserving beauty and important architecture, art? How can we help them manage these transitions? So let me tell you what we mean by transition at Partners. A significant transformation of a congregation and its relationship to its building and property. So sometimes people think transition means congregation closing, building sold. It can mean that, but it can mean lots of other things as well. So when is a sacred place considered in transition by our definition? When the building is empty most of the week and the congregation wants to be better stewards of the space. When the congregation comes to terms with financial realities, which means that it cannot support the maintenance and repair of the building and property alone. This is huge, especially in our older congregations, where, as you know, there is constantly something that needs to be repaired, and it's often not small. When I was first introduced to the work of Partners, I was working with a congregation in Hartford, Connecticut, an urban church that was built in 1807. The building was built in 1807. And it's a traditional New England congregational church architecture. The steeple was literally falling down. And because it is on the historic register, and so it should be, we had to do the work in a way that would make sure that that steeple was rebuilt as closely as possible to its original form. Cost us $2 million in a congregation of about 100 people. So this was a challenge, and had the congregation not received a grant from the National Fund for Sacred Places and the support of Partners, I don't know how they would have managed to make that repair. When the congregation has more buildings or property than it can use and a desire to sell or lease part of that property. This is the case often in those congregations to which I referred that built those extra buildings, that building that was largely meant for education with classrooms, sometimes a large gathering area. I knew a congregation that had decided it was going to be in the wedding business, and so built a building just for wedding receptions, except that what's happening now is that more and more and more people are not having weddings in churches or synagogues, but rather in wedding venues or outside, and they're certainly not having the receptions there. So now they've got this building. What are they going to do for it? They're a vital congregation, but they have this building that is simply costing them money and not contributing to their mission. When the building no longer aligns with the mission and vision of the congregation, so when they've got a humongous building, a small congregation, and they're spending so much money on the building that they really can't carry out the mission that they understand to be theirs. And then serious financial issues may come along. A congregation simply does not have the money anymore. In Ohio, I know there are many older congregations who may have endowments, but there are many who do not. There are also many who've probably been eating that endowment on a regular basis. And when that money goes away, they no longer have the means to keep the property together. And that may mean the congregation either leaving or finding a partner for the space. Another time is when two or more congregations ponder the possibility of merger. This is happening more and more and more. We're seeing 2, 3, 4 congregations in a town or in a general rural area deciding to unite, and now they've got several buildings that they don't need. So what are they going to do? Or when a congregation decides to disband and completely sell the building and leave the property. So what we encourage congregations to do is to do some self-assessment. Does the leadership and the entire congregation know about the repair and renovation needs of the building? Do they have an up-to-date conditions assessment? If there was one thing that I would advise anybody working with older or historic churches and synagogues, it's that they be encouraged to, as soon as possible, have somebody who knows what they're doing do that condition. So many sacred places have been being cared for lovingly by folk who are members of the congregation, who have been keeping it together with bubble gum and rubber bands for a very, very long time. And those folk will say, well, I know what's wrong with the building. And while they love the building, they don't have the expertise to know that. So those building assessments are critical. Do they have the capacity then, once they have that, to maintain the building in good repair? Do they have the ability to respond to unexpected, non-routine capital expenditures? The steeple falling down, the heating, the HVAC system dying, any number of issues. The roof is one that often gets to congregations, especially if there's something like slate roofs. Is the building fully utilized all day, every day? Does the congregation recognize the need to transition its property, but struggle to let it go? This is very, very real. And one of the things that we regularly advise congregations to do is to begin to work on this before it's too late, before they have lost the ability to make decisions because they're simply going to lose the property. Has the congregation made previous attempts to revitalize itself or to transition the building, and now are they at a critical juncture? There are options. And this is the thing that I most say to congregations is in most cases, it's not hopeless. There are options to consider. For example, remaining in place with new uses and or the sale of non-essential assets, that education wing, a piece of land that has never been used or built on. For example, Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Albuquerque, New Mexico is right now in the midst of negotiating a 20 to 30-year lease with the New Mexico Philharmonic. They will use their sanctuary space, which you can see in the picture, for rehearsals and performances. The congregation will continue to own the building and to worship in a smaller chapel. And so they're working out this rather complicated arrangement between the two, which isn't quite finalized, but we're very hopeful that it will be. So that's that one. Retaining so that first one is retaining ownership, but having a major anchor tenant. Retaining a presence while changing ownership. So this is sort of different than that. So in 2019, a private developer purchased the buildings and lands of Mount Airy Presbyterian Church. They're going to build single-story residences. And the church is renting back the sanctuary in the basement for their use for $1 a year because the developer was not going to do anything in the sanctuary. So this congregation, which had significant financial challenges in an expensive city, could now continue to do their ministry while having the property used and the original historic building maintained. Using financial and development incentives to stay. Cathedral of the Holy Cross, Boston, Massachusetts, stunning, stunning place. They utilized a ground lease to strengthen their financial building, their financial footing. A 99-year lease that enabled the developer to erect a 160-unit apartment building on their parking lot, which included an underground parking garage in which the church has 70 spaces. There are a number of ways that this happens, often in urban areas. So air rights can be sold, all sorts of financial things that allow a congregation to keep at least a part of their building. And then finally, if a sale needs to happen, we encourage a civic-minded sale. In other words, a sale that's consistent with the congregation's mission and vision and that creates a legacy for the congregation. This is a big, big issue. So working with a set of 3 Lutheran congregations in a city in Pennsylvania who are merging, and they were looking at the possibility of one of their buildings going to a not-for-profit that has been using space in that building for many, many years. And then a developer came along and said, you know, I'll just take all 3 of these buildings off your hands, and I'll make sure that the new congregation, the merged congregation, can get appropriate building with the money that I will give you. And what's going to happen to those buildings, one of which is in a historic district, I'm afraid, is that they may be torn down or substantially altered and turned into high-end housing, which will, in 2 cases, dramatically change the character of the neighborhood. I'll say more about civic-minded sale in a minute. Let me tell you about the Dominican Sisters of Cincinnati, Wisconsin. They own this humongous property, which you can see before you, and there are very few of them left. So they decided to sell many of the buildings on the campus, but the proviso is the new use of the buildings has to fit with their mission and purpose. In other words, nobody can go out to that beautiful, beautiful property and build a resort. So there's a 500-seat auditorium, a pool, and a wellness center. You see why I say nobody can build a resort. All of these great living spaces. And they want to do this so that it continues to serve the purpose that they originally imagined for this space. And the sales have not gone through yet, so I'm anxious to see what happens. They're going to retain ownership and use of a couple of smaller buildings on the property where they will continue to live until the last sister is no longer with us. So that's a large scale option around that, the civic-minded sale. This is particularly important, I think, in communities where gentrification is a problem, which is different from what the sisters are doing. So how do we talk about healthy transitioning? Anticipate the need to use, manage, and sustain the building in new ways. This really means doing new thinking. Sometimes this is a challenge for congregations. And so we need to help them to reimagine how this space might be used so they can plan and discern the best path forward. And starting by considering small transitions, such as sharing space in bigger ways. Perhaps sharing space with another church, which would mean they need to make the change of worshiping at a different time than they had before. This is a small transition, but it's got a big impact in helping a congregation adjust to change. And then consider the larger transitions, which may be necessary, that we've just discussed. So here are the tools that we use at Partners to help congregations come to make the decisions they need to make. We have a strategic visioning for transitions process, which helps a congregation look at its mission and vision and discern future options for its building. We talk a great deal about the concept of legacy. So many folk in congregations feel that the legacy of their ancestors is important. For the vast majority of people who attend worship in Christian churches today, they did not build the congregation that they're worshiping in. Now, a lot of the newer congregations and the independent congregations, this is not true for, but they're not the folk that are engaged for the most part in transitioning. The people who are in older and historic buildings. They didn't build those buildings. They didn't pay to have those buildings built. But all around, sometimes the walls, are the plaques to the people who did. And so an understanding of what was the intent of the folk who originally settled here, what was their hope for what this congregation could do, and how can we continue to have this building serve that legacy even though we're not in it anymore, or even though we change our relationship to it. Based asset mapping. So many of you may have done asset mapping exercises. I can answer questions about that, but the Partners' take on this is that when we do an asset mapping exercise, we don't just have members of the congregation there, we have community stakeholders, leaders, people who are involved in healthcare, in education, in the arts, all sorts of civic social service folk come together, get into them, and then sit with members of the congregation to just brainstorm, wildly imagine what might happen in this space. And that often leads to new initiatives, new programming, new partnerships, new resources, things that a congregation may not have thought of before for the use of this space. And we do design charrettes. So we bring together architects and designers and planners. We take input from those asset mapping sessions, and we have an intensive planning session to identify ways that the structures itself might be altered to accommodate new and expanded space use. So this can focus the vision and energy on an eventual capital campaign project, or simply help them understand that they can partner with someone who will help them make the changes that are needed in order to make the space still continue to be used within the community. So let me share a few other case examples with you, and then we can have some conversation. St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Syracuse, New York. It was vacant. The parish house was vacant. And the congregation had a history of embracing new immigrant communities and ministries that serve the homeless, as well as quality music. A major landmark building in the heart of a newly revitalizing downtown in Syracuse. So we did a variety of projects with them, including the asset mapping. The picture you see there is from asset mapping. And they planned a fundraiser for a major adaptive reuse of their parish house for ministry and for housing. University Lutheran Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, same thing, including a design charrette. The public value of this is well over $1 million. It's right in the midst of Harvard. And so they did a number of building improvements like accessibility, which is a big one these days, expanded community space, and now they have multiple partners that are joining with them. So that's the end of my presentation. I'd like to say a couple of more things and then open it up to any questions that you may have. I want to stress that when Partners for Sacred Places comes into a work with a congregation, Partners was founded as a preservation organization. So at our heart is a love for these buildings and the beauty that is within them, the architectural significance in them, the artwork that is in them. We also come in with an understanding that the purpose of these structures from the very, very beginning was to serve the community. So how is it that we can combine a deep desire to preserve history, to preserve beauty, to preserve artistic significance, along with service to the community, while at the same time balancing the struggles of congregations who may or may not any longer be able to support these places on their own? So really our key is partnerships. How can we bring people together to work on making all of this continue to be an important part of the community in which these folk dwell? So, Matt, I think I'm throwing it back to you. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Thank you so much. That was informative and interesting, and some of those churches are absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
So if you have questions on the chat box, please go ahead and type those in, and we can ask those and see what information we can get from you. Dr. Stackhouse, I'm curious, how are like the big non-denominational, can't even say it, non-denominational, the non-denominational megachurches, how are those directly or indirectly affecting our historic spaces within our communities?
Wow, that's an interesting question. So when the megachurches began to exist, they consciously did not want to be in the old settings. And the reason is because they were doing something very new, and they wanted people to understand that this was a new way of doing worship, a new way of doing church. They wanted to do things like have coffee houses in them. And so they consciously went to, many of them began in school auditoriums before they did their own purpose-built places. So this really radically changed a practice that had been going on in American churches for a very long time. Because in the past, what would have happened is what one of my colleagues calls a hermit crab congregation. So you know how hermit crabs change their shells as they grow? So in the past, what would often happen is that as a new immigrant community came in, or population changed in a city, often this was the case with white flight, and an older building would now be taken on by whatever population had moved in to that neighborhood, and then would continue to be used for worship and for service to the community. But what happened when megachurches came is they said, we don't want to do that. We want to have our own place. Understandable. But the impact of that then on the older buildings is that there were fewer people wanting to take on this expensive and complicated and perhaps sometimes looking in a way that folk don't understand as contemporary. So that's, from my perspective, that's one of the biggest ways that this has changed. Is that what you were kind of getting at?
Thank you. That's exactly what I was getting at. We do have a few questions. I want to throw one more out. The National Trust has a fund specific for historic churches and supporting that, and you mentioned it several times. Can you give us like a brief overview of that, and how does
Sure.
a church qualify or maybe wouldn't qualify?
Sure, yes. The National Fund, you can actually, the National Fund has a stunningly good website, National Fund for Sacred Places, and I encourage you to check it out. So this is highly competitive. We are in the last year of funding. It was funded by the Lilly Endowment. We do this in partnership with the National Trust, and we're hoping that Lilly's going to renew the funding because it's become a really important program for many, many congregations. So the major pieces of a church qualifying for that, and by the way, we have a new fund. There are two new funds, and I'll come back to the National Fund as it is now in a second, but I want to lift up two new funds. One of them has just come online, and this is a fund that is particularly for congregations who are predominantly African American. So that's a piece, and you can connect to that from the National Trust site, I believe. And then the other one is a fund that is currently in development because we are seeing the need for this more and more, and that is to serve synagogues, a historic shul fund. And that's not yet online, it's still in development, but it's going to be coming. So this is a model that we think is important. Back to the National Fund. For a congregation to qualify for the National Fund, it does not have to be on the historic register or in a historic district. However, it has to have some kind of architectural distinction or historic character to it. Now, historic, from Partner's definition, is anything older than 50 years. So it doesn't have to be built in the 1700s. But it has to be distinctive historically in some way. I mean, we have funded congregations, for example, in the South, a congregation, African American church, that was a really important place in civil rights. So the building itself does not appear to be that distinctive in terms of some of those photos you saw, but the historic nature of the congregation, of that building and things that happened there were. But it can't be an empty building. This has to be a building that still has a vital congregation. It doesn't have to have a large congregation, but the point is that the fund does not want to spend, to fund something that then in a couple of years, the building is going to be sold because the congregation can no longer support it. So it's important that the congregation still be viable and vital. It's a very competitive fund. This past year, we received about 400 letters of intent. And in about another 3 weeks, the recipients for 2022 are going to be announced. And I am not part of that process, so I can't tell you how many, but in a typical year, it would be about 12. So that tells you how competitive this is and how difficult it is to snag one of these. The other thing that's important to know about these is that they're matching grants. So they go up to $250,000. But if you get a grant for $250,000, you need to raise $500,000. There's a lot of support that goes along with receiving one of these that comes from partners to assist with that fundraising, among other things. So it's not just we give you the money and leave you there. There's an enormous amount of support that goes with that. So I encourage you all to check out the National Fund website, which will tell you a great deal more than that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, Devin, could you please facilitate the questions from our viewers?
Sure, Matt. First question is from Ellen. So Ellen asks, this question may not or may be beyond the scope of the webinar in your organization's mission, but can you define what is a sacred place? What about sacred places and spaces that are not within a church or other building or structure used for the same or outdoors as part of a landscape? And can you give some examples of these? And then let's answer that part first, and then I'll get to the other half.
Let's do that part first. Okay. Well, just a general definition of sacred place could certainly include a lot of outside spaces, and that's for sure. What makes a place sacred is a community having sacralized it. Now, it depends on how the community does that. If you're in a Roman Catholic church, there is a process for that to happen, a liturgical process to both sacralize and desacralize a space. But our understanding of it is that this is a place where some kind of an organized religious community has made its home. One could define sacred places in lots of different ways, but in our work generally, that's the definition that we would work with. Some kind of an organized religious community has made the place its home. We have not begun to work with outside places. We actually had a request about that not long ago, and we need to talk as an organization about that, because primarily we deal with the built environment and not with outside places that are sacred, even if they're used by an organized religious group. So that's where we're at with that. Hope that answered that part of that question.
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of what Ellen was asking there, so I'll move on to the next question. What percentage of congregations who transition stay in a transition facility afterwards, and what percent do not?
I can't give you that stat. That would be an interesting question to answer, but we have not done the research. Part of that, the problem with trying to get that stat is that there are no good statistics yet on, we don't even know for sure how many congregations are in transition mode across the country. There are general stats out there that I have seen anywhere between 3,000 and 6,000 congregations closing every year in this country. But that doesn't necessarily mean that those congregations were in purpose-built environments. Some of them were in storefronts. And so there's no really good way to get that statistic. So I can give you a gut on that. So just anecdotal without any statistical quality at all to it. It really depends on how the process has been done. And I think the most successful congregations are those that can find an anchor tenant that shares their values in some way. And so the partnership can be a productive one. And the congregation can feel comfortable with what's going on in the space. And then they're likely to stay. Now, the bigger picture of what's going on in organized religion in the United States is going to impact that in years to come. And the fact that in generations definitely below Gen X and even Gen X. Many fewer people are involved in organized religion. So unless that changes, I mean, eventually many of these congregations will die, but not because of what they did with their building.
Kind of building off of what you were just mentioning, David asks, how does the situation in the U.S. compare to other countries? Does the American tendency to always want something new make our situation different from other countries who tend to have longer histories and established practices of reuse of historic structures?
Well, that's really interesting. I spent 3 weeks in Scotland in June and July, and I was largely in the Inner and Outer Hebrides, and so the islands, the Atlantic islands. One of the things that I began seeing everywhere was former church buildings that are no longer church buildings. Let's see, I saw 2 that have been turned into private homes. I saw 2 that have been turned into restaurants. One that was, I was told it was an event space. I was in Cincinnati. So speaking of Ohio, not that long ago, and saw 2 buildings there. One was an event space and one was a restaurant. So similar. Europe was ahead of us in experiencing the decline in folk being involved in organized religion. So if you go into historic structures there that are still functioning as churches, there are very few people on any kind of regular basis who worship there. Here's the difference. In a number of European countries, there was state support of churches. In some, there still is. In others, it was up until very recently. So tax money was used. So the buildings that were historic and important had a revenue stream that they could tap that has never, well, not never, but has not been in the case in this country since 1800 in general. And that's made the big difference there in terms of the saving of those buildings for as long as they've been saved. On the other hand, my husband's ancestral roots are in Scotland, and we went to a town where we know his ancestors, one of his ancestors had been baptized. We went to the church to find that it has been sitting empty for 3 years and had a big for sale sign on it. This was a church that was built in the late 16, early 1700s. So if you want to buy a church in the middle of nowhere on the Kintyre Peninsula in Scotland, it's all yours. So it's happening everywhere. The difference has been state support, I think, in general in European countries.
I don't know, Devin. I think a church in Scotland would make a lovely remote office for us. That sounds wonderful.
As long as it has internet.
Yeah, well, that I'm not sure about. I was trying to sell it to partners for, Partners East, and they were not going for it. So.
So to continue this vein a little bit further, so Gina's asking, you mentioned that urban areas tend to have the most challenged congregations. I'm curious to know if you see a concentration of these in any particular geographic regions of our country, and if so, where are those?
An interesting question. And I would say, by the way, I think I'm not sure that it's accurate to say, if I said it, I unsay it, that urban congregations are challenged more. There are many rural and small town congregations that are deeply challenged right now. Actually, the very first congregation I served, which is in northern Lower Michigan, is now a theater. And it was in a town of 3,000. Which was the county seat, which tells you what the low population was in that county. We have been talking with a presbytery in Kentucky about a very rural church there that is now empty, that's actually quite historic, and they can't figure out what to do with it because it truly is in the middle of nowhere, and they can't imagine anybody that wants it. So there's a real problem in rural places as well. In terms of the urban, so the congregations, this is just has to do with migration. The congregations in the Northeast and the Southeast, those buildings tend to be among the oldest in this country. And so those often are in the most decline, also because religiosity in the Northeast, at any rate, has been in decline for some time. I think that the Midwest, because it tends to have more church-going folks still, there are perhaps stronger congregations there, and yet my Michigan church being an example, also my husband's home church, which is in Saginaw, Michigan, in a city, is currently about to go under, and a very large and beautiful and historic building is going to be up for grabs. I think it's all over the place. I really do. The Pacific Northwest is actually a sort of a new place for us that we have been invited to come and do some work, because it's beginning to happen out there. And that's never been a particularly highly religious part of the country. But there were some very old and very beautiful buildings built there that are now in trouble. So I think it's pretty endemic across the country.
Continuing on, Nancy asks, can you describe what a church should include or watch out for as it works to develop part of its space for retail development, such as putting a bistro in a building on a church campus?
Okay, so let's see. Number one, taxes. Number two, zoning. These two things the congregation absolutely has to get a handle on before they even think about making a contract for retail space, because a lot of places have the real frustration that a lot of congregations find is that they'll hear about a church in one town that did that, and the tax thing was not a big deal, and the zoning thing was not a big deal, and yet in another town it was. It really depends on local officials. So those two are critical pieces. The other thing is sometimes congregations are full of, well, always congregations are full of nice people. The problem is when you're negotiating a business deal, handshakes really don't make it anymore. So it's really important for there to be attorneys involved in this who can help make sure that everybody's interests are respected, and that the boundaries and the parameters for this new retail project are carefully put in place. So those would be the top three things that I would advise. And then, I mean, the other one I think has to do with the neighborhood. The people around a sacred place are stakeholders in what happens there. And a lot of congregations don't think of it that way. You know, it's their building and they're the ones that decide, and yet there is an impact on a neighborhood. So a coffee shop might not be a big deal, but there are other kinds of retail that might be. So, you know, if you're going to do a bistro, what are the hours of that going to be, and how is that going to impact the neighborhood? Is there going to be live music? How is that going to impact the neighborhood? So it's important to make sure that you communicate with neighbors. I have a negative story around that I can share that is a sort of an over-the-top illustration. Working with a congregation that shall remain unnamed in a large urban setting, which is not Cleveland or Cincinnati or Columbus, but in another state, that owned a piece of property and decided that they were going to sell it to a commercial developer, who then built a very tall building with luxury condominiums. Now, the congregation had never talked to the neighbors about this, had never convened a neighborhood meeting, had never actually thought very carefully about what impact on the neighborhood this kind of development would make. And thus, they have generated over a decade of ill will that now impedes their progress on some other projects that they've got. So it's important to be in contact with other stakeholders in the neighborhood. I could say more, but I think that'll take us to where we need to go. I hopefully answer that question.
Thanks, Shelly. Barb has a question, kind of getting into the emotional aspects you were just discussing. So she is saying her congregation is in discussion of transitioning our sacred space into housing for men who are transitioning from prison back into the local community. We fear a legal fight with the neighborhood. How can we counter this negativity in the community?
Boy, oh boy, I'm very excited for you. That's the kind of thing we love to see happen. You have got to open a conversation with leaders in the community and do it right away. I mean, there are several options, most of which would include inviting people into your space and having a meeting about this, having a conversation about this, having presentations. I assume you're doing this with an organization that serves the population of folk who are coming out of prison, and that would be really important. So you're going to want people from that organization to come and to do a presentation. You're going to want to lay out to the folk in the neighborhood what the boundaries are around this. What are the security procedures that are being taken? You can understand why folk might be anxious about this if there's a large residential area around the congregation, but this has been successfully done elsewhere. So one of the things you might want to do is talk to the organization you're working with, reach out through social media or whatever to try to find another place where this has successfully happened and get those folk in to talk about it. If it's within reasonable traveling distance, see if you can get a field trip together with some community leaders to go and take a look at how it's working elsewhere. That would be, I think, just the main thing to say is communicate, 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 and don't get to the point of opening this before you've communicated with people. Start from the very beginning.
Great advice. Leslie is asking that she's on the board of a group trying to rehabilitate a historic Black church that was abandoned and is now empty. Are there any special resources and issues for us?
The longer a place, this is true of any building, and y'all know this, the longer a place is empty, the more problems there are. So I don't know how long this place has been empty, but having that good, solid building assessment is going to be critical if you haven't done that yet, to make sure that systems are still operational, that there are no major structural problems that need to be addressed, so that you have a really clear idea how much money it's going to take to rehab this place. Again, find partners in the community, in civic leaders or whoever it is that's going to use the space to help you communicate with those who are in the neighborhood around you about what's going to be happening to this place. They're probably ecstatic that something's going to happen, because an empty building is a target just for all sorts of things that are problematic. And if it's in an urban setting, even more, because of things like rodents, among other things in empty buildings. I mean, I think that's the most important thing, is to be clear on what you're getting yourself into ahead of time.
Thanks, Shelly. That was our last question we had typed in. So if anyone has any final questions, get them in the next minute before the webinar ends here. I'll turn it back over to Matt for a moment, though.
So while we have just a couple minutes, I'd love to put in a plug for a resource that I think can be really helpful. Partners website, whoops, sorry about that. I thought I had a slide with it, but I don't. Partners website is easy. It's sacredplaces.org. We don't have a chat function here, do we? Or do we?
Oh, we do. I can type it in.
Okay, www.sacredplaces.org. If you go to our website, and there is a tab for information and publications. And if you click on that, you will see that there's a publication called Transitioning Older and Historic Sacred Places. And we are sacred places, by the way, not sacred spaces. People do that all the time. But transitioning older and historic, is that what the chat is? Can I write there? Okay. So what I'm doing is typing. And I can't type and talk at the same time very successfully. Okay, transitioning older and historic sacred places. This is free. You can download it for free. And it's got all kinds of resources in it, including a lot of the material that I put on the slideshow comes out of that book. And there's more there as well that can help congregations to begin, especially to do the self-assessments that might help them understand where they need to go, along with suggestions of other resources and those options that I presented. So you might want to check that out. I turn it over to you.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation with great resources and great ideas. We hope our attendees found that helpful and informational. The webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel probably within a day or two. So please, if you want to share this with others who are working on historic buildings or within your own community, please feel free to do that. Thank you for joining us today. Our next webinar will be presented October 12th by the Small Business Administration, and we'll discuss tools and programs for economic development. If you would, please follow Heritage Ohio on Facebook to stay up to date on our events and upcoming trainings and seminars. If you want to be a supporter of Heritage Ohio and support great programs like this, please visit heritageohio.org and click the Support Us orange button up in the right column. Dr. Stackhouse, thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate the information that you shared and your expertise on this matter, and we hope that you will have helped save some historic buildings in Ohio.
I hope so too. Thanks for having us.
Have a great day, everybody.